Well, okay. Welcome back. We are now moving on to the next chapter. As you see, the topic here, knowledge and intelligence. Now, at a first pass, these two topics probably seem to have a close alignment to each other. You might imagine sometimes when you're thinking about intelligence and trying to understand what intelligence is, it might be natural to think of things like, okay, to be intelligent means that you know a lot, right? And therefore you must have a lot of knowledge. Well, that certainly must be at least partially true. But as we get into these notes here, we're going to see that there is an important difference, and that intelligence really is not defined in that way. When we look at a lot of research in modern intelligence, we instead look at things related to reasoning and problem solving abilities. And of course, as you may remember in the previous chapter, that was a major theme in that chapter was how humans engage in reasoning, judgment, decision-making kinds of tasks. And we, of course, saw that there were certain biases at work here. So we might need to think about that again when we look at the intelligence part of these notes. But the first part of these notes instead is going to focus on the knowledge part. And so one of the important things we want to talk about here, as I have titled here, we're treating knowledge as what we want to think of as a mental representation. And we've talked about this before. So if you think back to the beginning of the semester, we've talked about the history of cognitive psychology as treating cognition as some form of computation and using a computer as something of an analogy of what the mind and the brain is. One definition of computing that we had was the phrase rule-based manipulation of symbols. And well, that's a kind of a fairly vague phrase, perhaps, but it's doing a lot of important heavy lifting here because we need to ask questions such as, all right, if we're doing rule-based manipulation of symbols, we want to ask questions like, what are the rules? What sort of manipulations? And what are the symbols? And so far in this course, we've talked perhaps a lot about the kinds of manipulations. Those are the various cognitive processes like encoding and storage and things like that, right? How we're manipulating the information. The rules might be some of the stuff that we do with working memory and executive control and things coming from the judgment and decision-making literature that we covered in the previous chapter. But then the other question is, what are the symbols, right? And here we need to ask the question of, okay, what's going on in here, right? How are the ideas represented? What is their structure? What is their organization? And and how exactly are they represented? And so there's a long list of different ideas here in terms of how we might organize knowledge. And many of these we've talked about before, so I won't necessarily go into a lot of super detail about each one of these, right? But schemas are the old ideas that come from Bartlett, this kind of broad way of organizing knowledge around a central theme or a central concept. This also, of course, factors into Piaget's developmental research on how children start to form their schemas as the more and more that they interact with the world, and then they assimilate new experiences into those schemas and then adapt and accommodate those schemas as they have new experiences. I believe we've talked about semantic networks when talking about language and how information can be organized in a model of a network where you have nodes that represent concepts and they're interconnected to other nodes with branches that where the length of the branch represents the similarity, the semantic similarity of the concepts, and then we follow a spreading activation model here. In the perception notes, I think we talked a little bit about some hierarchical networks, but if not, I have a note on the further slide here coming up. We'll talk about what the hierarchical stuff is all about. We've talked plenty about neural networks in the perception notes, right? Artificial neural networks. The other questions here is related to imagery, which I think did come up again in those previous chapters. So do people have rich perceptual imagery? Can we close our eyes and imagine a red star? That's the classic kind of vividness of mental imagery task. But of course, we can claim to have all kinds of rich internal mental imagery that is visual in nature, not to mention even auditory, such as the inner monologue, or whether you can like hear like music in your head and have that earworm kind of an effect going on. So there's all kinds of internal perceptual experiences that we can sort of imagine and recreate in rich detail as if we're having that actual perceptual experience in an internal way. So that could be a form of a representation, if you will. But of course, we also then need to factor in the whole phenomenon of aphantasia and how does that influence how we understand the nature of mental representations. And that, of course, throws a pretty big wrench into a lot of this. And then we also have the issue of concepts and categories, and that's something that we're going to need to focus on in a little more detail because this is somewhat new for us so far. But categorizing things is something that is very much inherently a function of how human cognitive processing works. We are categorizers. This is what we are. We experience, in particular, what we call categorical perception. One fairly simple example that's not here on the slide is color vision, right? So if we think about this, when we look at the light refracted through a prism or through water droplets in a cloud that gives us a rainbow, we see all of the colors of the rainbow, right? Your Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? Now, what we're looking at when we see those distinct seven colors uh, is a spectrum of different wavelengths of light. And that spectrum varies continuously from around 400 nanometers to around 700 nanometers. So that's over 300 nanometers worth of continuous variation in the wavelength of the light. But we're not seeing 300 different things, right? We see just the seven categories of red, orange, yellow, and so on. So perceptually, we are categorizing that information into a much smaller set of values. Mathematically, this is called dimension reduction. The information coming in terms of electromagnetic energy has a high level of dimensionality, which just means there's lots of variation. But through the process of dimension reduction, we collapse that down into a smaller, more manageable set of useful pieces of information. So what's useful to us is perhaps to distinguish short wavelength light from long wavelength light. So distinguishing blue and green from red might in fact be somewhat useful. Distinguishing 400 nanometer light to 402 nanometer light might not be super useful. So we can effectively collapse those to the same color, right? And so, of course, this also fits with some of the stuff we covered on working memory and attention, which is that we do not have unlimited perceptual and cognitive capacity. So dimension reduction is pretty important. And we do this with other things too, like the dogs on this screen. So here we have four images of four very different looking animals. But nevertheless, when we look at each one of them, we can say that yes, each one is a dog. And so we are faced with a kind of a classic question here, which is what exactly is it that we are looking for when we look at any one of these specific particular animals to know that it's a dog? This gets really tricky because the individual features here are all very different from each other, right? So we can list things like, does it have a fur coat? Okay, yes, they all do. But of course, lots of other animals do too. So how do we distinguish animals with a fur coat that some are dogs and some are not? So maybe it's walking on four legs and having a tail. Well, again, so do lots of other animals. Is it snout, pointy ears? Well, not all dogs have pointy ears. So now we're starting to get into some challenges. Uh, and um, and of course, we see so much variation in the size, the shape, the fur coat, the colors. Everything can be so drastically different, yet we can still all look at them and say, yeah, that's a dog. In fact, small children can also do a pretty good job of looking at various types of dogs and knowing that they're dogs. So that means that we have variation in the world out there, right? There's lots of different kinds of animals, and they vary in a more or less continuous fashion with regard to all of these little traits they have about their body morphology, we could call it. And we perceptually carve it up into these categories of dogs and cats and squirrels and rabbits and horses, and on and on and on we could go. So the first thing we have to ask here is, okay, what's the perceptual thing, right? What is it that we are actually seeing when we look at any one of these animals that we can know it's a dog or a cat or whatever it else? But this also relates to a broader cognitive question, which is I've created this category of things in my mind called dogs, and I want to know then at a conceptual level, how am I defining dog, right? And well, that's a kind of a tricky thing. And by the way, before I go on, that's one more example is the thing about chairs, right? And I have some chairs behind me you might be able to see, and they vary a little bit in their appearance, right? And you can think of all kinds of different chairs, right? A simple wooden chair, like a school chair, an office desk chair, like the one I'm sitting in, or say a recliner, cozy chair, or the kind of chair you have for a kitchen table, a dining table, um, and on and on and on, right? There's all these different kinds of chairs. And what about a stool, even, right? Or other things like a tree stump, right? Is that a chair? And so again, we have lots of different things that we call chair. So that means we have this concept and category of chair in our minds, but they can all be quite different from each other when it comes to the superficial or particular details of their appearance. So yet again, we need to think about what is it that makes a dog a dog? What is it that makes a chair a chair? What is it that makes red red and not green? And these are kind of tricky things to answer. To an extent, I don't have an answer to those questions, right? But the point is that from a cognitive psychology perspective, we want to understand the nature of human categorization and how things work, right? So one example of this is the perceptual theory we did cover before called feature analysis. And so the claim here is that in order for an object to be recognized as a member of a category, it must have certain features. One classic way that this comes up is when talking about letter recognition. So let's look at the title of the slide, the word categorization. The second letter is the letter A. It has three features, we might say, right? It has a diagonal line on one side that's kind of leaning towards the center, and then another diagonal line, pretty symmetrical, on the opposite side that's also leaning to the center. And then there's a small little horizontal line that connects them. Or there's the letter T, a bit simpler, which is one vertical line and then one horizontal line above that, right? So we can talk about the presence of those features. And so we could say that, well, what happens here is that in order for something to be a T, we have to identify the features that are considered necessary and sufficient. So what does that mean? Well, for a feature to be necessary means that in order for that feature to be definitive of the letter T, it has to be present, and it's not a T unless that feature is there. So obviously then something like a curved line or a circle as a feature, as we have maybe with the letters C or the letter O or even the G and so on, could not be necessary features for the T, right? But also there's the issue of sufficiency. So is the vertical line itself a sufficient feature for the letter T? And the answer is no, because we can also have other letters that have that feature, like the letter I, or even parts of the letter N or R, or even the U over there kind of has some vertical lines. The letter L and the E have some vertical lines in them. So we would say that the features themselves must be both necessary and sufficient in order for them to qualify as somehow definitive of helping us identify that category. So we might say, okay, well, you have to have both the vertical and the horizontal together in just the right way for it to be the letter T. That's fine. But one of the things we need to worry about here is what happens when we have to factor in things like different fonts. Because now with a different font, especially some sort of fancy script font, now your vertical line might not even be vertical, right? It's possible to draw a letter T where the vertical stems is kind of wavy and it leans to one side or another. And nevertheless, you can write in cursive, of course. You can just have really sloppy handwriting, even. But within some limits of reasonability here, you can still read the letter T, even when it's a weird font or pretty bad handwriting, and it won't have any of those same features. So that's where feature analysis really starts to get pretty tricky here. So the question is, do we represent concepts like the different letters by features? Doesn't seem to work out very well. And of course, going back to an example like dogs and chairs, what are the exact features that we have to talk about here, right? Is it the snout, the ears, the tail, the fur coat, on and on? Again, that gets to be pretty challenging because dogs can still be a dog without the feature, and therefore that's not a necessary characteristic. And on top of that, other animals besides dogs might also have those features, so it's not a sufficient characteristic either. So we're running into some concerns about how the feature approach is going to help us. Now, we did talk about the template theory as well, and I don't think we need to really worry about that too much. It's not going to help us with categories, right? A template was the idea of having a separate mental representation of every possible variation of a thing. And not only does that lead to some problems that we refer to as being computationally intractable, that there's far too much information for the brain to deal with. That's the exact opposite, by the way, of the dimensionality reduction that I referred to previously. So I don't think that's really going to help us here. Now, there's another way here to talk about mental representations that are sort of template-like, but they are more simplified, more abstracted, and more idealized. And we can refer to them as either prototypes or exemplars. I'm kind of oversimplifying two different theories here, but let's just, for that purpose, we'll keep it simpler here. So in this argument here, we're going to represent the letter T in its more idealized perfect form. And so that represents my ideal exemplar letter T. The same might apply for even recognizing dogs and chairs, is that we have some sort of kind of concept of what we could call the stereotypical dog, right? The ideal dog, whatever it is we think of when we think about a dog. Now, this matches the hierarchical stuff that I mentioned earlier. So Eleanor Roche, she did this research where she shows people a picture of an animal, like a bird or a dog, and she asks questions such as, is this a bird? And people will say yes, if it's a bird, of course. But you might also show them the same picture and say, is this an animal? Uh, or you might say, is this a robin? And so the question, is this an animal, is asking at what is called the superordinate level. And people, of course, can be correct and they'll say yes, but their reaction time is a little slower in comparison to saying, is this a bird? And likewise, when people are asked to say, is this a robin? Again, that's working at the subordinate level. So again, reaction times might be a little bit slower. Although what we did talk about was expertise here. And so their claim was that, okay, if you ask a bird expert the same question, maybe they'll do better at the subordinate level because that's what expertise is doing here. It's kind of shifting your attention down to the subordinate level instead of the basic level of operation. But here's variations here where if you're shown a picture of a robin and you say, is this a bird? And then if you are later shown a picture of a penguin and asks the exact same question, is this a bird? People's reaction times are a bit slower when seeing the penguin. So that would suggest here that you're recognizing robin is a bird faster than you are recognizing penguin is a bird. So what accounts for that difference? And it might be that this image of a robin is much closer to the exemplar of a bird, right? It sort of gets really a whole lot closer to what you might imagine the stereotypical bird look, right? Whereas penguins are very atypical as birds go anyway. So that's the idea, is they're far from the exemplar, perhaps, right? So that would seem to suggest that there is at least some tendency to represent in these terms of these prototypes and exemplars, right? And that would be one of the primary ways to account for that. Right? But of course, it is worth pointing out that however it is that we define objects is associated with some degree of subjectivity as well. This is called the fuzzy boundary problem. And so, just as I noted, there seems to be fuzzy boundaries between dogs and cats because they share so many features, but at the same time, that boundary is not necessarily open for debate. Right? I don't think people would necessarily ever have an argument about a dog being a dog or a cat. And this is separate, by the way, from talking about its genetics. Obviously, we can do genetic testing of these animals to look. Of course, when you get into genetics, there's plenty of fuzzy boundaries there too, by the way. But I'm just talking at the level of just general conceptual understanding that I don't believe that there's any specific breed of animal out there that has generated debate. That's a dog. No, that's a cat. That's a dog. No, that's a cat, right? People don't do that. Well, when it comes to some categories, there might be disagreement here. So people ask questions. This is just, silly things people argue about online, like is a hot dog a sandwich? Is a taco a sandwich? And this has led to such debate that we have these charts here that people have tried to say that okay, it's a sandwich if you've got this appropriate structure, right? Where you've got some form of bread on the bottom and on the top. That's choice number two there. Doesn't matter what goes in between. If you have that kind of structure here, then but it's all based on the cube shape, right? And so you have six sides of a cube. So whether it's toast or a sandwich or a taco or whatever, depends here on which sides of the cube contain the bread part, right? And down here, we can also debate at the bottom about the not just the structure, but also the ingredient components here. So we can be a structural purist and an ingredient purist for sandwiches, but then of course we can deviate in both of those dimensions here. And there's all kinds of other situations where people might debate about these different things, right? And even that one in the middle there about a whale being a fish. Like I said, people don't necessarily argue about dogs and cats. But people used to argue about whales and fish. And obviously, now with our modern understanding of genetics and mammals and so forth, we know that whales are not fish, and that's an objective claim. But long enough ago, before anyone ever really understood this, then people did, in fact, think whales were fish. And so over time, this kind of category changes as well. So that means that the categorization that we form, what's the kind of the take home here, is that not only are there fuzzy boundaries, but these boundaries are dynamic and they can change. And that means we can learn them as well, right? And when I say they're dynamic and they can change, is that especially the case where, let's, get to that debate about whether a hot dog is a sandwich. It could be possible, for example, that I say, yes, a hot dog is a sandwich, and you're like, no, that's nonsense, right? But we debate it and we work it out. And then one of us might win this debate, and then that means one of us is changing our minds, right? So that means we're changing our category boundary here to say, all right, I'm going to be willing now to move my boundary one way or another because you've convinced me I'm right or wrong, right? Few other things to say about categories here. Essentialism. Now, one thing I want to say about essentialism right off the bat is that kind of from a scientific perspective, it doesn't hold water, right? So as I'm noting here, this is a philosophical idea, an outdated philosophical idea that things can be defined by having some sort of essence, right? So a dog is a dog because it contains the essence of dogness, or a cat is a cat because it has the essence of catness or whatever, right? And therefore a sandwich is a sandwich because it has the essence of sandwich, right? And that's where you can see this start to break down, right? Is that okay, maybe dogs have an essence. They really don't, by the way, but of course that's at least more compelling than talking about a sandwich having an essence of sandwichness or something like that. So from this kind of as a way of describing why things are part of categories, it's not because they have some objective eternal essence that defines them. But despite the lack of standing this has in philosophical and scientific circles, average people still might think about objects in this way, right? And that's important from a psychological view, right? As psychologists, we want to understand how people think about the world, and that means that people do adopt essentialist beliefs about things, and that can apply to a variety of things. I think it's a good example here is to apply it to our idea of stereotypes, right? The idea is that if we believe that some particular group, some stereotype applies to that particular group, it's as if we're saying that they all have that essence, right? And again, you can see how that's an outmoded way of thinking. Another way of thinking about categories is the concept of the affordance. This comes from the perceptual theory of James J. Gibson. And Gibson talks about an affordance as opportunities for action in the environment. And then other researchers have suggested that, okay, can we use the affordance as a way of defining categories then, right? So if something has the affordance of sittability, meaning you can sit upon it, well, that makes it a chair, right? And therefore, it doesn't matter what what features it has, right? So all of the little details about features would be kind of superfluous at this point. As long as you can sit on it, that makes it a chair. And one of the other ways in which this starts to have some appeal is that in modern cognitive science, there is this movement towards what's called embodied cognition, which suggests that the way in which our bodies are shaped and the way we can move, our effectivity, that influences our cognition and our representation. So perceiving the affordance as a way of categorizing the world would be very consistent with an embodied view of cognition here. Now, this all works fairly well, but it does have some limitations here, right? One example is, what about a little tiny chair that you might use in a dollhouse? Is that still a chair? You can't sit on it, right? So at that point, it doesn't really have the affordance of sittability, though we might say that it could serve as a representation of the affordance, or maybe it affords sitting for the doll. So we call it a doll's chair, perhaps, right? But this requires that we have to start doing a little bit of extra work here to explain these unusual cases. On top of that, it becomes a little harder to explain what makes a dog and what makes a cat a cat. Do dogs have a certain affordance that would define their dogness? That's there could be some things that could be said about that, but it certainly is not clear exactly what that would be. So we'll leave that open as a question at this point. Yet another way to think about categories is to think about the artificial neural networks that I mentioned a minute ago. As we noted in the perceptual chapter, artificial neural networks technically work as classifiers, like the perceptron model, if we go back to that. That's exactly what it's used to do, right? It is used to classify an image. I think the example I used was pictures of ducks, if I'm remembering correctly here, right? So if you show it pictures of ducks and you show it pictures of other things that are not ducks and you give it feedback, then eventually it starts to learn certain rules and about the presence of certain features in the images that are present every time it's an image of a duck. And so it starts to be able to correctly classify over time. Now, what is it learning? What are the features that it's finally figuring out and detecting here? And the answer is we actually don't know, right? This is the idea about one of the kind of the weird things about these deep learning kinds of algorithms is that the rules that they eventually end up using to distinguish, say, duck from non-duck are what are considered opaque, right? We can't actually get in there and see what it has done. We just know that its output is that it can correctly label images as duck and not duck. But one of the upshots of this kind of research, by the way, is that it does suggest that the mere fact that such a machine learning algorithm can be successful and it's only relying on features present in these various images, this would seem to suggest then that maybe categorization can occur based on features after all. So that's one possibility, of course. One other thing to consider is that when we previously talked about the difference between explicit and implicit knowledge, this is when we talked about memory systems, that explicit knowledge is the stuff that we can verbalize. And so when it comes down to saying things like, well, what makes a dog? And I'm saying, well, okay, it can't be the fur coat and the forelegs or the tail or the pointy ears or any of these things. So I can't necessarily name it, but nevertheless, I can still identify a dog when I see one, right? So it's this old idea of I can't define that, but I know it when I see it. And that's the exact definition of the difference between explicit and implicit knowledge. With explicit knowledge, I can define it, but with implicit knowledge, I just know it when I see it. So it might be that there's a lot of category formation and the rules of categorization are happening at a more implicit level cognitively, and that's why we can't easily define the categories that we actually know and learn about when we're just, say, 2-year-old kids learning about dogs and cats. So, of course, that's another possibility here. Okay, we're going to call it a stop here with this particular topic, moving from knowledge to intelligence. We'll make another video about this. So, as always, let me know if you have questions.